It happened on a narrow road in Sicily. Two generals, one obsession: which army would reach Palermo first? And what George Patton said in that Momenta Euro, what he said when Montgomery stepped onto his Rota Euro, would echo through military history for decades to come. Neither man backed down. Neither man accepted defeat. This was not a minor disagreement between officers. This was a collision of wills at the highest level of command, unfolding in real time during one of the war's most critical campaigns. And the consequences would reshape how Americans fought the rest of the war. You're watching a channel dedicated to the untold stories of World War II Euro, the moments that history books pass over in silence, the words spoken in fury and frustration that reveal the true character of the men who led millions to victory. We dig deeper. We listen harder. And today, we're examining one of the most revealing confrontations of the entire conflict. The date was July 1943. The American 7th Army had just begun the invasion of Sicily. General George S. Patton, Jr., the lightning commander of American forces, was racing westward across the island with one objective in mind: to capture the coastal city of Palermo before anyone else could claim it. He envisioned a daring envelopment, a sweeping movement that would cut enemy forces in half and prove once and for all that American tactical genius matched British caution step for step. But standing in his way was General Bernard Montgomery, the methodical British commander whose 8th Army occupied the southeastern portion of Sicily. Montgomery had his own plans. He wanted to push northward from Syracuse. He wanted to secure Highway 124 Euro, the main road corridor that connected the interior of Sicily to the northern coast. And he wanted no American interference. The road became everything. It was a strategic artery of the campaign, the single corridor through which supplies, reinforcements, and momentum could flow. Montgomery believed it should belong to the British. Patton believed it should serve the American advance. And between them lay a question that neither man was willing to leave unanswered: whose army was faster, whose plan was better, and whose vision would define the invasion of Sicily. Patton had a reputation. He was a general who did not wait for permission. He was a man who believed that audacity won wars. His philosophy was simple: movement, aggression, and speed. In his mind, an American army that moved faster, struck harder, and refused to accept offensive postures was an American army that would change the course of the war. He had studied military history obsessively. He had written about tactics and strategy. And now, in Sicily, he was determined to prove that his theories worked. Montgomery, by contrast, represented an entirely different approach. He was a careful planner. He prepared the ground methodically. He believed that wars were won not through heroic charges, but through superior organization, through concentration of force at the decisive point, and through patience. He had already proven himself in North Africa, defeating Rommel at El Alamein just months before. To the British High Command, Montgomery was the officer who had stopped the German advance. He was the man who could be trusted. When Patton's forces pushed for Highway 124, it was not a simple request. It was a demand. The American general wanted the road, and he wanted it now. He needed it to support his drive toward Palermo. Without it, his entire operational concept collapsed. With it, he could outmaneuver the British, seize Palermo, and prove that American forces could operate independently and achieve results that matched or exceeded anything the British could accomplish. Montgomery's response was unambiguous. No, the road belonged to the 8th Army. The British had captured it during the invasion's initial phases. British soldiers had bled for it, and Montgomery was not about to hand it over to an American general, no matter what that general's rank or reputation might be. The tension escalated. Messages flew between the two commanders. Appeals went up the chain of command to General Alexander, the supreme Allied commander in the Mediterranean. But Alexander was caught in an impossible position. He needed both armies to succeed. He needed American support for future operations in Europe. But he also could not afford to alienate the British, whose vast military machine had sustained the war effort for years before Americans arrived in significant numbers. On July 13th, Patton decided to act. He had grown tired of negotiation. He had grown tired of waiting for bureaucratic decisions. He ordered his forces to advance onto Highway 124 regardless of what Montgomery said. His troops would use the road. His supplies would flow through it. And if Montgomery objected, well, Montgomery would have to find another way. What happened next was not a battle in the conventional sense. It was not a clash of armies or a large-scale engagement. It was something far more significant. It was the moment when American commanders openly defied British authority in a theater of war where British command was still technically supreme. Patton's units moved onto Highway 124 in force. And when Montgomery realized what was happening, he sent a staff officer to confront the American general directly. The officer arrived with a message. General Montgomery wants to know what you think you're doing. Patton, according to accounts that survived the war, was calm. He was polite, but he was also utterly unmoved. He told the British officer that he was advancing American forces where he believed they needed to go. He noted that the road was strategically vital to the American campaign, and he made clear to Euro in language that was respectful but unambiguous to Euro that he did not intend to stop. The British officer returned to Montgomery with the message. Montgomery was furious, but Montgomery was also constrained. He could not order American forces to withdraw. He could not override an American general's decision about the deployment of American troops. And he certainly could not do so without escalating the conflict to a level that would damage the entire alliance. General Alexander, confronted with the reality of American forces on Highway 124, made a decision that would alter the course of the campaign. He authorized the Americans to use the road. He authorized Patton's drive toward Palermo. And in doing so, he signaled something that Britain and America both understood. The balance of power in the alliance was shifting. American forces were no longer junior partners. They were becoming the dominant military force in the Mediterranean theater. Patton's forces raced toward Palermo. They covered 70 miles in less than a day, moving faster than any American army had moved since the Civil War. They entered Palermo on July 22nd, and when they did, Patton stood at the front of his column and smiled. He had beaten Montgomery. He had won the race for Palermo. And more importantly, he had proven his point. American tactical aggressiveness, when matched with superior logistics and determined leadership, could outpace even the most carefully planned British operations. What Patton said when Montgomery stepped onto his raw to Euro, or rather, what he did when Montgomery tried to block his raw to Euro, became a turning point in the coalition war. It was the moment when American commanders began to assert themselves with confidence. It was the moment when the American military began to understand that it did not need to wait for British permission to operate. And it was the moment when the structure of command in the Mediterranean and eventually in Europe began to shift fundamentally. The campaign in Sicily continued. Montgomery's forces pushed northward, and Patton's forces pushed westward, then northward, completing the conquest of the island by August. But the seed had been planted. American generals had learned that they could act decisively. They had learned that audacity, properly executed, could succeed against more cautious opponents. And they had learned that the strength of American industry, American logistics, and American manpower could overcome almost any obstacle if they were deployed with sufficient determination. Some historians argue that this momenta Euro, Patton's advance onto Highway 124, his refusal to be stopped by Montgomery, his race for Palermo Euro, revealed something fundamental about how the war would end. The British would provide strategy, experience, and organizational brilliance, but the Americans would provide momentum, resources, and an almost inexhaustible willingness to take risks. When those two elements were combined in alliance, they proved unstoppable. When they conflicted, the American element ultimately prevailed. Patton himself understood this intuitively. He was not a political thinker. He was not a strategist concerned with the fine points of diplomacy. He was a man who believed that warfare was about movement, energy, and will. And on Highway 124 in Sicily, he had proven that belief. He had stepped onto that road, and he had not stepped back. Montgomery, for his part, never fully forgave Patton for what happened in Sicily. Years later, when they would meet again in different theaters and different circumstances, the tension between them remained. They respected each other's military abilities. But there was an edge to their relationship, a memory of the moment when an American general had refused to accept British authority over his actions. The broader consequence of that refusal rippled through the rest of the war. American generals became increasingly confident in their own judgment. They became increasingly willing to question British plans or propose alternatives. And when the time came to plan the Normandy invasion, the cross-channel assault that would ultimately decide the war in Europe, American commanders entered that planning session with a sense of quality that they had not possessed before Sicily. Eisenhower, who had to manage the American commanders and their growing confidence, understood what had happened in Sicily. He had watched Patton operate. He had seen Montgomery's carefully orchestrated campaigns. And he understood that the future of the coalition depended on channeling American energy and aggression in productive directions, while maintaining an alliance with Britain that remained strategically vital. What historians often overlook when they discuss Patton and Montgomery and the military history of World War II is that both men were right in different ways. Patton was right that aggressive movement, when properly supported, could achieve results that careful planning might miss. Montgomery was right that methodical preparation prevented the kind of costly failures that came from overconfidence and insufficient planning. The best generalship would have married these two approaches. But that synthesis was difficult to achieve when the two commanders could not get along, when their philosophies clashed, and when national pride and military ego seemed to matter almost as much as the mission itself. The road that Patton seized in Sicily was not just a military objective. It was a symbol. It represented the moment when American commanders stopped deferring to British authority and started asserting American military power. It represented the point at which the Second World War began its transition from a conflict led by British experience to a conflict increasingly dominated by American resources and American willingness to take risks. When Montgomery stepped onto that road, he was stepping into a moment that would define the rest of the war. And when Patton refused to yield, when he pushed forward despite British objections, he was asserting a principle that would guide American military actions for the remainder of the conflict. The American army would move fast. It would move decisively. And it would not wait for permission when the moment called for action. In the years after the war, both men reflected on these events with different perspectives. Patton spoke of the necessity of aggression, of the importance of taking risks, of the value of movement and audacity in warfare. Montgomery spoke of the importance of planning, of preparation, of avoiding costly mistakes through careful analysis. Both perspectives contained truth. Both approaches had validity. But in that moment on Highway 124 in Sicily, it was Patton's philosophy that prevailed. What we learn from examining this confrontation of Euro, what emerges when we look closely at the tension between these two commanders of Euro, is something fundamental about the nature of military leadership during the Second World War. Leadership was not simply about technical competence or strategic brilliance. It was about confidence, about the willingness to act under uncertainty, about the courage to assert your vision even when powerful voices opposed it. Patton possessed that kind of confidence. He believed in himself and in his army with an almost absolute certainty. That certainty sometimes led him into difficulty. It sometimes put him at odds with his superiors, but it also drove him to achieve results that seemed impossible to more cautious commanders. When he seized Highway 124, when he pushed toward Palermo, when he refused to accept Montgomery's authority over his operations, he was asserting this confidence, and the results spoke for themselves. The invasion of Sicily was successful. The Axis forces were expelled from the island. American forces proved that they could conduct large-scale amphibious operations, maneuver across difficult terrain, and achieve operational objectives with speed and efficiency. And the confidence gained from that success of Euro, the confidence that Patton had demonstrated and helped to instill in his forces of Euro, would carry American armies through the rest of the Mediterranean campaign, through the invasion of France, and eventually to the heart of Germany itself. When you look at the Second World War today, when you study the great battles and the great commanders, it is easy to focus on the grand strategy, the large-scale movements, and the ultimate outcomes. But history is also written in moments of tension between commanders, in decisions made under pressure, in the clash of competing visions about how wars should be fought. The moment when Patton stepped onto Highway 124, when he claimed that road for American forces despite British objections, was such a moment. It was a small event in the context of a global war, but it revealed something essential about how that war would be fought and who would ultimately shape its outcome. If you value historical depth of Euro, if you want to understand not just what happened in World War II, but why it happened and what it meant for the course of the conflict of Euro, we invite you to subscribe to this channel And join us as we continue to explore the hidden narratives and decisive moments that shaped the Second World War. The road that Patton sees in Sicily became a symbol of something larger: the emergence of American military power, the confidence of American commanders, and the willingness of the American army to move forward with speed and determination toward victory. That road and the confrontation it represented mattered more than it might have seemed in the summer of 1943. And understanding that moment helps us understand the war itself and the alliance that won it far more clearly than we might otherwise.